Jai Hind everyone. I am Shruti Jain, Assistant Professor, MCA Department, Ajay Kumar Garg Engineering College, Ghaziabad. The topic that we are going to discuss today is risk management, and this topic is covered under the subject software engineering. The subject code is KCA 302 and this is for the MCA second year students, third semester. So coming to what exactly is risk, if we talk about any of the software development process, whenever we are developing a software or a project, the risk is basically a problem that may cause some loss or threaten the success of the project, but which has not happened yet. So every time we have a risk whether the project will be covered in time, whether the cost of the project will not exceed, or are there any unforeseen circumstances which may lead to a delay in the project, or the technology change might happen. So risk is the potential that a chosen action or the activity will lead to a loss that is an undesirable outcome. That loss can be in terms of the cost, the time, the technology, or any other circumstances which will adversely affect the progress of the project. So potential losses themselves may called be risk. So if we talk about the typical software risk, so Capers-Jones, he has identified the top 5 risk factors that threaten the projects in different applications. The first factor is dependencies on the outside agencies or the factors. Whenever any of a particular company which is developing a software, if that company is dependent upon different agencies or different factors, then the risk factor increases whenever we are working on a software, because the dependency is on a third party. If they stop working, then it will adversely affect the progress of the software. So availability of trained and experienced persons. So if you are dependent upon outside agencies, then you have to take care of the availability of the trained personnel who are required for the development of a software, whether they are trained in such a manner that the software development is done in the optimized manner. Then there are again intergroup dependencies. Suppose we multiple groups are working all together. Now each group is dependent upon the other. Now if there is a conflict, group conflict that arises, in that case the software development would be adversely affected. The customer furnished items or information, again we have different factors or different agencies where we are working with. The customer furnished the requirement of the customer. Now customer may also change his or her demand, or they may provide a different information while they are developing a software. So in that case again the software risk increases. Internal and external subcontractor relationships. Now suppose we had a contract of maybe a year or two, or during when the software is to be developed. Now if there are minor changes or the changes in the policy that are being the policies that are laid by the government, if there are changes over there, then those will again affect the policies between the two contracts. The second point or the second factor which leads to software risk is requirement issues. There are certain uncertain requirements which lead to the development of the risk. Those uncertain requirements could be like the user, because user is a layman person. Now he might have certain requirements which were not necessary for the software, but still he wanted those requirements to be incorporated into the software, and the resultant of those requirements would be the wrong product, that is the product that is developed at the end, the final product comes out to be a wrong product that was not required by the customer, or the product was produced the way it needs to be done, but it is produced in a very bad manner that later on the maintenance would prove to be more costly. So the requirements again are one of the factor where the risk of the software again increases, because we cannot say that the user can appropriately give all the instructions or his requirements. He can explain all the requirements the way they are to be incorporated into the software, but even a single uncertain requirement may lead to the development of the wrong product. These uncertain requirements, it is not necessary that these are from the user side. It could be because of the wrong understanding of the requirements from the developer side as well. So whatever requirements those are uncertain, which are either given by the customer or understood by the developer, those uncertain requirements may result into a product which is of no use for the customer. So either of the situations result in unpleasant surprises. Unpleasant surprises would be a right product developed very badly, or unhappy customers where the customers are unhappy with the performance of the team in order to develop the product that they wanted. The next factor that may lead to the risk is the management issues, where the project managers usually write the risk management plans, and most people do not wish to display their weaknesses into the public. Now, we cannot every time say that the management is of the top quality or they have all the managerial skills, which might not lead to the loss in the software. But again, we have some of the management issues where the people are not trained in such a manner that they are able to avoid the loss. There may be the circumstances where the inadequate planning of the whole of the software cycle is done, because it is a management which develops all of the plans, so that the loss, if in case is there, then it can be incurred in such a manner that there is the least wastage of the resources. Inadequate visibility into actual project status. So the vision was not very clear how to proceed with the project, so that at the end the project status that needs to be final is still in the progress state. Unclear project ownership and decision making. Again, the managerial personnel were not trained in such a manner that they were able to take the right decision for the right situation, due to which at the end the project has suffered a loss. Staff personality conflicts, like we have seen over here again, that there were intergroup dependencies. Now these intergroup dependencies could be between two different agencies, one within the organization and one outside the organization. But when we are working with the management, here again there could be the conflict between different management people, and their conflicts may result into the overall loss of the software. Unrealistic expectations. Everyone start with some of the expectations that the software needs to be completed within the time, and this is the cost. But if everything is done in the whole of the calculative manner, then those are the realistic expectations. But unrealistic expectations could be where the developers are saying that the project would take maybe 1.5 years to complete, to reach to the end, to deploy the final product to the user, and the management wants them to complete it within a year. So this is an unrealistic expectation, because all of the planning will be done considering 1 year, but because the project is is to be developed in such a way that it is taking 1.5 years, then those unrealistic expectations and budgets and all the planning will go in waste, because those are unrealistic expectations. Poor communication. Now there may be some of the communication gaps between the management people, which again leads to the risk in the overall development of the software. So the communication needs to be very much proper, and they are to be aligned to all the steps whenever any of the decision is to be made regarding a project. The next factor is the lack of knowledge. We have discussed few of the points previously. The first one is again the inadequate training. Be it on the management part or the developers part or anyone who is involved in the development of the software. If they are not properly trained, then it will always lead to, it will always be a risky situation where the project might turn into a loss. Poor understanding of methods, tools and techniques. Now the company is trying to provide the training to all the people, but still there are people who have not understood the methods or the tools or the techniques, or they are using the outdated methods or tools which will again affect the working of the software. Inadequate application domain experience. Now the people, it is not necessary that every person is having the knowledge of all the type of domains in which they are working or the company is working. It might be a possibility that a software that is or a project that needs to be taken up is from the Android application domain, and the person is not very much trained or very much aware about the Android working. So there, his experience would not affect or would not help in the development of the software. So that again is a risky situation. Advent of the new technologies with the nowadays we know that the time that we are going through, the current scenario is a scenario where the new technologies are evolving every other day. So the incorporation of those new technologies into your software is very important. So if we talk about a time period of 1.5 years to develop a project, within that 1.5 years, it is not necessary that there will be no new technology that is coming. So the project needs to be compatible with the new technologies that are evolving during that time, so that the customer is also satisfied and it takes less time in the maintenance of the software in the later part. Ineffective, poorly documented or neglected processes. Again, it may be a possibility that currently the software is not a risky software because you have documented everything, but that documentation is done in a very poor manner that whenever we are working on the software in the maintenance phase or when new technologies need to be incorporated, there this documentation will not be of any help because it is not maintained properly into a standard document. The other risk categories include the unavailability of adequate testing facilities. If the project is not tested properly, including the black box or the white box testing, or the unit system testing or integration testing or any other type of testing, if the tools or the facilities are not provided for the testing of the software, then again there is a risk, because the software may work abruptly on certain inputs which the user is giving, and that those inputs are not tested into the testing phase. Turnover of essential personnel is again a risk factor. Unachievable performance requirements, technical approaches that may not work, where we are taking some of the methods or the tools to incorporate into our software, but that software is not of such a kind that it can use all those approaches or the techniques. So now comes what is basically the risk management. So risk management is a process of identifying, addressing and eliminating these problems that we have just discussed before they can damage the project. So it is the identification, assessment and prioritization of risk, followed by coordinated and economical application of the resources to minimize, monitor and control the probability and or impact of the unfortunate events. So what is that process? This process describes the steps that are needed to identify, monitor and control the risk, because even if we know that these all are the factors and they are prevailing nowadays in each and every organization, but still we must need to have some of the measures so that this risk can be controlled properly. Within the risk process, a risk is defined as any future event that may prevent you to meet your team goals. So risk process allows you to identify each risk, quantify the impact and take action to prevent it from occurring and reduce the impact it should eventuate. So this process, the risk process, helps you to identify the critical and non-critical risk, document each risk in depth by completing the risk forms, log all the risk and notify the management of their severity, take actions to reduce the likelihood of the risk occurring, reduce the impact on your business, those risks that are taking. So the first thing that we need to do when we are working on the risk assessment process or the risk management process, that is the assessment of the risk or the identification of the risk. Because whenever we are assessing any of the risk, we need to identify what all sort of risks are there in while you are developing a software. So while you are developing a software, on one hand, the identification of risk what kind of risk may arise if we are working with one part, or if we are adopting another technology, what kind of risk may include. If suppose some calamity occurs or unforeseen situation occurs, then how those kind of risks are to be identified. Once that identification of risk is done, then we analyze those risks, which involves the examining how the project outcomes might change with the modification of risk input variables. So once that risk factors are analyzed, are identified, now we try to analyze them, like if suppose this this risk factor occurs, how will our software act in that case. So what will be the project outcomes if we modify those input variables. Once that analysis is done, now we prioritize the risk, where we try to identify which risk would be more harmful for the project and which would be the least harmful one. Then comes the risk exposure. It is a product of the probability of incurring a loss due to the risk and the potential magnitude of that loss. So when we know that these all are the risky factors, or these are least risky, now using those risky factors, we try to identify the probability of their occurrence, number one, and how much loss will be incurred if suppose that risk actually occurs. Once that assessment of risk is done, now we move on to the risk control phase, where we produce a plan for dealing with each significant risk on the basis of the priority. So the risk prioritization is an important factor, where we try to prioritize the risk and then we try to control them. Controlling will need a proper planning how to deal with each of the risks. So in that case, again, when we are producing a plan, we need to record the decisions in the plan, like if this is a plan, how will it work. Risk resolution is the execution of the plans of dealing with each of the risks. So if we look into the figure over here, the first step that we talk about is the identification of risk, where the risk is identified, identification of the risk, then we try to analyze that risk. That analysis of risk takes up in the qualitative manner, like we do not have exact situation, or like we do not have any tangible thing which can be measured while we are analyzing the risk. When we are analyzing the risk in the form of the quantitative assessment, where we can measure all those risk factors, then it becomes the risk assessment. These two are communicating with each other, because this talks about the qualitative analysis and this talk about the quantitative assessment. Once this identification is done, the analysis part is done. Now it moves on to the risk response planning. How that risk is to be responded back, what plan should be made so that the least risk is to be least risk occurs or least damage occur to our software. So this planning again moves into the analysis part, assessment part, then again planning, and it is a continuous process. Once this planning is finalized, now we try to monitor and control the software under that particular risk. Now this identification and monitoring is again related to risk identification, because once it is monitored and controlled, then again we'll proceed to another risk identification, and hence the whole of the process proceeds. So this is what we have discussed. Risk identification is to determine what risk exists or are anticipated, what are their characteristics, their remoteness in time, the duration period and the possible outcomes. The risk analysis is a process of defining and analyzing the dangers to the individuals, business and the government agencies that are posed by the potential natural and human caused adverse events. In IT, a risk analysis report can be used to align the technology related objectives with the company's business objectives. A risk analysis report can be either qualitative or quantitative, as we have seen over here. When we have the qualitative report, that is the risk analysis, and this risk assessment comes out to be the quantitative report. The next one is risk planning, which is developing and documenting the organized, comprehensive and interactive strategies and methods for identifying those risks. It is also used for performing the risk assessment to establish risk handle priorities, developing risk handling plans, monitoring the status of risk handling actions, and determining and obtaining the resources to implement the risk management strategies. When we talk about the monitoring and control, it is identifying and analyzing the new risks, keeping track of them, and forming contingency plans in case they arise. That is, we are talking about the new risks that originate. It ensures that the resources that the company put aside for a project are operating properly. So, risk monitoring and control is important to a project because it helps to ensure that the project stays on track. Now, we have two types of risk strategies. The first one is the reactive risk strategy and the other one is proactive risk strategy. When we talk about anything that is reactive in nature, so reactive means when the risk has already occurred. Now, what steps you are taking in order to handle that risk comes under the reactive risk strategy, where the focus is that the risk has already occurred and now that the steps onto those, the handling of those risks takes place. Proactive risk strategy is where the risk is yet to occur, but you have taken all the measures in order to avoid the occurrence of those risks. So, if we talk about the reactive risk strategy, the reactive risk strategy monitors the project for likely risk. Resources are set aside to deal with the risk when they become the actual problem. So, here there is no work done initially till those risk has actually becoming a problem. Once that those risks become a problem, only then the resources will be utilized that are set aside for that particular risk. Software team does nothing about the risk until something goes wrong. Then the team attempts to correct the problem. This is often called a firefighting mode, where the fire has already occurred and now the firefighters are going there and trying to handle that situation. When team fails to solve the problem, the crisis management takes over and the project is in real very bad state. So, reactive risk strategy basically talks about the handling of the risk or the handling of the project once that particular problem has already occurred. While in the proactive risk strategy, it is better than the reactive strategy. It begins long from technical work before the technical work is initiated. Potential risks are identified. Their probability and impacts are assessed and they are ranked by importance. Software teams, they establish a plan for managing those risks. As all the risks cannot be avoided, the team works to develop a contingency plan that will enable it to respond in a controlled and effective manner. So, once you are proactive, you are before occurrence of any of the calamity, you are working on it, how to handle it, so that calamity will not affect that much to your project, like we have seen into the reactive risk strategy. So, the software risk management plan, the first one is to monitor and mitigate. So, to be effective, the software risk monitoring must be integral to most project activities. Essentially, this means that frequent checking during the project meetings and critical events. So, monitoring includes publish the project status reports and include the risk management issues, revise the risk plans according to any major change in the project schedule, review and reprioritize the risk, eliminating those with the lower priority. Brainstorm on the potential new risk, because with the advent in the change in the technology and the environment, new risk may come up. After changes to project schedule or the scope, when a risk occurs, the corresponding mitigation response should be taken care of from the risk management plan. Now, what is mitigation? Mitigation option includes to accept that risk is impacting a project, make an explicit decision to accept the risk without any changes in the project, avoid, adjust your project scope, schedule or constraint to minimize the effect, take action to minimize the impact and reduce the intensification of the risk, because This normally happens when you are in a reactive strategy. Implement an organizational shift in accountability, responsibility or authority, because the current focus should be how to handle that risk for the development of the software. Often suitable for low impact risk, monitor the project environment for potentially increasing impact of the risk. So, a software risk management plan should include jumpstart your risk management, look at the integration level risk, start from the unit part, then the integration, then the system, and then measure your level of software risk in your critical applications. So, here we are talking about the 3 dimensions to characterize the project risk management techniques. There are 3 criteria. The first one is the phase of the risk management process, the phase of the life cycle of the process, and the corporate maturity towards the risk. These are the 3 dimensions which characterize the project risk techniques. These dimensions encompass the most relevant aspect for understanding and choosing among project risk management techniques. The focus is on risks that occurs in the projects which are in turn run by the companies. Such dimensions reflect the crucial concept that the risk practices can only be selected once a problem is structured, well understood, and the application act as the instruments which depend upon the circumstances of the problem. The first tool that we have is Jira, that helps the developers to identify and track issues and bugs in the software. Then we have Jenkins. It is an open source automation server that can be used to automate various software development processes, including the testing and development, deployment. Then we have Git, which is an open source version control system which is widely used by the developers to track the changes in the software code. It allows the team to work collaboratively, manage different versions of code, and ensure that every change made to code base is tracked and documented. Then we have Selenium. It is an automated testing tool that helps the developers test the web-based software applications. We have SonarQube. It is again a code quality management tool that helps the developers maintain the quality of their code. It can be used to identify coding issues and ensure that every line of code meets the required quality standards. So that's all for today. Thank you.